Excellent. Well, thank you guys for all coming out, and thanks to DP Review for putting this on. As was mentioned, I'm going to be talking about telling stories through photography. And I actually have quite a bit to go over, so I'm going to go ahead and try to go through this as briskly as we can so that you guys can really pick up what I'm trying to say here. So I want to start things off by asking a simple question, and that's, why are you interested in photography? Now, this is a simple question that I think a lot of people don't ask themselves. They don't understand why they get into the art form to begin with. For a lot of photographers, they get into photography because it allows them to have an extension into their interests or their passions. Some people love to go outdoors. Photographers some individuals love to do gardening, and maybe they get into macro work with flowers, or maybe they love the idea of travel and they want to stay taking their camera with them when they start heading out, jumping on airplanes and traveling around the world. Some photographers do it for the experience. They do it for the fact of the matter of traveling to different cool locations, or just taking your camera out and stepping outside of your own comfort zones. And some people get into photography because it's a creative outlet for them. It allows them to look at a scene and capture it in a way that is an artistic expression. It allows them to essentially to see and capture something in a way that they envision it, and then share that with other people. And ultimately, I think that the real answer is that it's kind of a little bit of everything for everyone. And the idea is that we have something to share with our photos. The reality is that when we take a photo, we're not just holding on to it. We're gonna put it out on social media. We're gonna put it on our websites. We're gonna share it with our friends and family and colleagues. So the idea that we have something to share is a very important element, and something that's gonna allow us to progress into this idea of storytelling. So every image has a story to tell. That's an important precedent that I want to bring up with you guys when we're talking about this subject, is that every single image has something to tell. Now, how engaging or how interesting that story is depends on a lot of different variables. Now, even from the beginning of photography, with the camera obscura all the way through Kodak Eastman, things have been the same. These are two of the first major photographs ever taken. One in 1826, the other one in 1826, the other one in 1838. And essentially, both of these images are telling something interesting. Now, what it is telling is up to both the artist that originally took them, as well as the viewer that is learning to decipher what that story actually is. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard the mantra that a photograph is worth 1,000 words. And if that's the case, in my personal opinion, there's a difference between a photo or a snapshot like this. This is of the Japanese snow monkeys, the national park out there in Nagano, and a photograph. And to me, the difference between the two is that a photograph truly has something compelling to say, and a snapshot is simply capturing of a moment or experience that you're trying to share with other people. So when it comes to photography, when it comes to creating a photograph, the idea is that you want to tell something that's a little bit more engaging. You want to tell a story. You have something more important to say. And what I want to get to with my presentation is the idea that photographers are visual storytellers. We use the artistic medium of photography in order to share our experiences, share our creative vision, share our emotions, our feelings towards different things. Now, the reason I put this up here is I recently both read this book and saw the movie. So anyone else here have read the Martian book? A couple hands. So Andy Weir wrote this book. And in that book, at least on my version, which is a digital copy, there were 303 pages. This artist, I believe our author is considered an artist, has 303 pages to tell a story. It's quite a bit of time. If we think of the movie, I took my wife to go see this on Friday. The movie was 142 minutes. That's 142 minutes in order to tell a compelling story. With a photograph, a lot of the times, you have a single frame. You have a single frame that you are limited to, in order to tell an interesting and creative story. And to me, that is a challenge, but it's also pretty awesome to realize that the power that you have when you pull a lot of the elements that we're going to talk about in a second together in order to create something that's captivating, that really allows the viewer to pause and to sit there and say, wow, what is this story, what is this photo trying to tell me? And to me, that's something unique that really separates the idea of a photo to a photograph. It's the difference when you look at National Geographic, and I don't know if anyone caught my colleague and fellow Sony artisan, Christina Mittermeier, the other day for her National Geographic talk, where she talked about, she was the keynote speaker for this event, and any National Geographic photographer, when you start looking at the National Geographic magazine, all those photos share that same element, where most of them are in pieces where it's a story, so there's 4 or 5 images, but all of them are powerful enough to stand on their own. And to me as a photographer, that's what I want to do with every single one of my images. I want every single one of my images to stand out a bit. I want them to tell something that's engaging. I want to move people. So how do you tell a story in a single image? We've talked about the fact that movies have hundreds of minutes to be able to do this, and books have hundreds of pages, and you have a single frame. So how do you do this? Well, let's start off by looking at a typical story arc. Okay, you have your exposition or your beginning, where you're essentially setting the scene of what's happening. You have your rising action, where you're essentially kind of directing the viewer towards a culminating event. You have your climax, where you have some sort of big epiphany moment or a big challenging piece for your subject. Then you have falling action and ultimately resolution. Now, the benefit of photography is the fact that you really don't have to focus on all 5 of these different aspects. You're really only focusing on the first couple. You got to set your scene, you're looking for your subject, and you kind of want to direct the viewer in a general way that allows them to have a better possibility of understanding what you're trying to tell them. And when you take a single image that allows you to kind of pull all those elements together, to me, that is, again, what separates and creates something unique that allows people to stop in their tracks and say, wow, what is it about this image that I like? What is it that's special? What is that story that it's trying to tell me? This is a photograph of a Lutheran church in southern Iceland, and obviously the northern lights happening around it. And all the different elements of this photo came together to tell a story that I wanted to tell about this specific moment, about this specific place. Now, I can set up the viewer to a certain extent, and then the rest of it is up to you guys viewing this image right now and anyone else that's viewed it before or after you guys to determine the ending of that story. But I've set everything else up for this. And we'll talk about the different elements here in just a second to really kind of go through my recommendations in order to create more compelling stories, more compelling photographs in reality with each of your own work. So to start things off, what you really have to do is you have to change your mindset. You no longer can think of yourself as just a photographer that's just out there to capture a single moment. You got to think of yourself as a storyteller, as an individual that is creating an artistic piece of work that allows you to share or express or to tell a story in some form or fashion. And this happens from all the different elements that, again, we're going to cover here in just a second, from your composition to subject selection to the different exposures, how you deal with lighting. All these different elements come together. They're all variables in the story. The next thing that you have to do is you have to study your environment. Now, I focus on landscape travel and humanitarian photography, so a lot of the time I have the ability to take my time when I'm approaching a scene or event. This is not the same for every type of photography, but for mine it is true. So in this scene, I'm sitting there, I had one of my assistants take this shot. I'm looking over the beautiful mountains in the Lofoten Islands in Norway, and what I'm doing is I'm actually taking in the scene. A lot of the time when I get to a new location, I don't have my camera out to begin with. The reason for that is that I'm trying to get a feeling, to get a sense of where I'm at, what I'm trying to shoot, and try to figure out where I want to start with telling my story. And a lot of the times I can't do that if I have my camera out ready and I'm just super excited to be in a location. I'm running around everywhere trying to find the right compositions and shooting everything. To me, that just doesn't work. And the interesting thing that's happened with the digital aspects of photography changing over from the film days is that I think a lot of people take a lot of these elements for granted. because you can. Historically, when you're shooting film, you had 24 rolls, maybe 36 rolls, and every time you developed a photo, it cost you money. And because of that, I think a lot of people were a lot more conscientious of the choices they made when they were photographing pieces around the world. Now with digital, you can take hundreds of thousands. I can go out on a shoot for a single shoot and take 10,000 images. That doesn't necessarily mean that 10,000 images are going to be good, but I do have that ability. So my first piece of advice along this lines is essentially to slow down. If you have the ability and you're shooting something that doesn't force you to be under a timetable, or you're not shooting obviously a sports event where you can't be missing the action, but if you have the ability, soak things in a little bit, get a feeling for where you're at, and that should allow you to have the ability to slow things down and figure out the direction you want to go. The next piece is we need to find our main character. We need to find our protagonist. Who is going to be the focus of our story? Now, when it comes to picking your subject of your photo, I think a lot of people get very confused and they get overwhelmed, especially when it comes to landscape and travel photography. There's just so many options out there. This is a picture of Lower Yosemite Falls in Yosemite Valley in Yosemite National Park. And inside this valley, if anyone's ever been, there are hundreds of thousands of images to be captured. Now, what is it that makes this special? I wanted to capture Lower Yosemite Falls. I found nice framing. I kind of put the pieces together. But the starting point was saying, okay, this is what's drawing me to this scene. This is what has pulled me in, that has captivated me to take this photo in the first place. I need to identify my hero of my story. This also works for travel photography. And travel photography, it could be anything from the actual event, it could be the motion of people in a market scene like this, it could be the actual location for this temple in Tokyo, Japan. It could be all these different elements. But the important piece is to figure out what is that element, what is that subject, who is the hero of your story that is pulling you in, that is captivating you to want to take a picture of it in the first place. I think a lot of people don't take that time to signal that out. Or it could, of course, be a person. This is an individual. As mentioned, I do quite a bit of photojournalism work and humanitarian work. This is an individual trying to sell Sprite and Coke bottles in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. I was there just after the earthquake, and something about this man really captivated me when he came up. And I asked him if I could take his picture. The emotion that he was telling me in his eyes for the struggle, the strife, everything that he was going through, to me was a story that I wanted to tell. I identified it as my main focus, as my subject, and then I moved the rest of the pieces around. Now, it's also important to note that when it comes to subject selection for a photograph, it could truly be anything. It could be a color, it could be a pattern, it could be an emotion, it could be an individual, it could be a feeling. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that is tangible like waterfalls in Yosemite or a specific temple or even a specific person. Regardless, the important piece is that you're signaling out who's going to be the focus of your story. Now, emotion and atmosphere, these are big, important elements in every book that you've read and in every movie that you've gone to the movie theater and see. And it's important in photography as well. And when it comes to emotion and atmosphere, to me, there's a couple variables at play. But the biggest one is light. Now, as a photographer, one of the biggest things that we're doing all the time is we're chasing light, regardless of what we're trying to focus on, whether it's a beautiful sunset or an individual or a flower or food photography or selfies, whatever it is. We're constantly playing with light. And for me, creative use of light allows you to paint a scene, allows you to create an atmosphere that brings together a certain amount of emotion with an image that otherwise wouldn't have it. And the interesting thing about light and photography is the simple fact that every single photograph, every single scene has a minimum of 6 different correct exposures. And what I mean by that is essentially the light meter inside your camera sitting there and saying your variables between ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all have a minimum of 6 different variations that it can essentially give you balanced light according to your light meter. And that's only talking about balanced light. This photo is not balanced light. There's way more dark pixels than we have light pixels or midtones. But I creatively chose to take this in a way that allowed me to create the ambience or the atmosphere that allowed it to be a lot more engaging. And the same thing can be used in terms of of creating emotion can be used with actually motion, a word inside motion. So a lot of times, and especially in a lot of my landscapes, where it's a little bit difficult to think of the idea of A, telling a story, and B, adding emotion to a landscape photo, is to add elements such as movement. So here you have two photos of Iceland. One of this is the Gullfoss waterfall, very prominent. And we have beautiful movement happening. We have lots of depth adding. We're creating a sense of atmosphere, a feeling of where we're at. And then with the Northern Lights, obviously there's movement happening in the scene. That allows the viewers to kind of feel like they're part of what's happening, to really get engaged and allow for a little bit of that emotional attachment or emotional bringing into the story that we're trying to tell. Now the next piece is we need to frame our story. Okay? We need to figure out what's the overall setting. What's the box that we're trying to put everything into? Now, with this obviously comes down to composition. So compositional selection. So how can we sit there and frame where we want everything to be, where we want our main player to be, where we want the atmosphere we just talked about, all the different elements, what is our box? And again, I think a lot of people don't cognitively think about composition. They sit there and look at a beautiful scene, like these icebergs again in Iceland. You have a nice sunburst happening. You have the mountains in the background and the balance of the clouds. But pulling all those pieces together, instead of going crazy ultra wide and capturing all this other stuff, this is the scene, this is the bookends of the story that I wish to tell. Now this image of Lower Antelope Canyon is one of my most viewed. I probably have about 7 billion views on this image alone. The interesting thing about it is that I spent probably 4 or 5 minutes trying to find the exact right composition that I could in order to tell the story that I was trying to tell with this, which was the focus of my subjects on being the different layers that places like Antelope Canyon and other places like it have to offer, and being able to balance the light for the time of day that I was in there, and being able to move my camera around, adjust it on the tripod to essentially get it to that right place that allowed me to balance everything together was an integral part of making this a compelling image. The next piece is you need to direct your viewer. So we've identified our subjects, we're trying to add emotion and ambiance to what we're doing, to atmosphere, we've set the scene for the overall scope of where this is going to take place. Now we need to direct our viewer. And a lot of this, again, comes down to compositional techniques that allow you to direct people through essentially your canvas. Your photograph is your area where you're trying to tell your story. And so using elements like leading lines, allowing you to direct your viewer to make sure they're paying attention to who you made as your selection for your subject. In this, we have 2 images from Australia. The image on the left with the water is from a place called Christmas Island. Little waterfalls tearing off, and the little small water leading out to the ocean allowed me to direct viewers throughout the entire scene, allowing me to make sure that everyone is paying attention to as many parts of the story as I possibly could. Same thing with the Sydney Opera House. This is an event in Sydney called Vivid Sydney, where essentially tons of light, they put up lights all over the different skylines throughout the city. And this specifically, I positioned myself just under the projector, allowing the light to kind of direct people exactly where I wanted them to be. Again, with my humanitarian work, sometimes it just works out with the scene, where I wanted people to pay attention to all different aspects of this young Haitian boy working in a school, learning to write his name in English, and allowing my subject to almost essentially be pointing people in the direction of the story that I was trying to tell, essentially helping me out direct people towards the plot. Now the next piece of advice that I have is remove any unnecessary plot twists. How many times have we seen a movie where your subject is all of a sudden the good guy and then the bad guy and then the good guy and the bad guy and you don't know what's happening? The same thing can happen in an image. And a lot of this comes down to distracting elements. So my biggest piece of advice when it comes to this is to simplify. Try to take out those distracting elements that are essentially pulling people away and distracting them from that story you're trying to tell. This photo of dogwoods in Yosemite National Park, I essentially used a mixture between light and composition to make sure that the leaves that were underneath it were not distracting to the subject of what I was trying to showcase. This is a young Tanzanian boy just outside the Serengeti. And when I was out there, he caught my eye when I was walking past his classroom. Everyone else, all the other kids were at school, and I wanted to focus on just him. And a couple other kids actually ended up coming back in the classroom when I went in to photograph this young man. And essentially, I wanted to make everything about him. I wanted to paint the scene. I wanted to essentially remove all those distracting, anyone else that might get into it, make sure that the light was perfect, all the different elements to make sure that nothing was distracting from my subject, from the story that I was trying to tell. And of course, take the photo. It's easy to talk about all the different things that you need to do, and eventually you have to get to a point where you're saying, okay, enough is enough. Let's take the photo, review it, see where we are, and then we can kind of go through the process again. Now I want to talk about some more tips and tricks that kind of follow along with a lot of the different stuff that we just talked about, but goes into a little bit more detail. So the number one thing is photograph something that you're passionate about. I think a lot of people don't realize that if you're photographing something that you truly love, that you truly are passionate about, whether it's wildlife or your own family, or you love gardening and maybe it is macro work with flowers. Like when you photograph something that you're passionate about, it really makes a difference because you become more invested in what you're trying to capture. I love wildlife photography. I'm not a wildlife photographer. But when I'm out there in the scene, I love integrating different aspects of the animals in the travel destinations that I photograph. And same thing about travel in general. That's why I got into photography, because I love the idea of traveling to different places and seeing different beautiful things. This is Banff National Park in the city of Banff in the Canadian Rockies. I love being out there in the cold. It doesn't bother me. And so when I'm out there, I'm not being distracted by any of these other elements because I'm hating what I'm shooting. I love this, and that to me makes me put a little something extra into my work. And again, my humanitarian side. I mean, there's one of my companies, The Giving Lens, that we briefly talked about, focuses all on photo education and support for sustainable development initiatives. And so when I'm out there and I'm working in places like Haiti or East Africa or Southeast Asia, I'm truly passionate about what I'm photographing. And that, again, allows me to put that something extra into my work that I think allows it to separate itself compared to if I was photographing something that I just wasn't really into. Develop your digital darkroom skills. So this image is the original image of a photograph I took of Yosemite Valley. And what I did is I took 3 different images in a bracket. And because of wind that was happening and probably user error, the first 2 versions weren't sharp because things vibrated a little bit. And the only one that was sharp, surprisingly, was the one that took the longest exposure. Now, in most scenes, when you look at a photo like this, when you're going through your images, you might be like, okay, it's done. I can't do anything with it. This is the end result of that same photograph. Now, I shoot with Sony, as we mentioned. I'm a Sony artisan of imagery. I use the Sony A7R in this, which has a wide dynamic range, which essentially preserves details in the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights. And because of that, because of the technology that I was using, I was able to pull out one of my favorite images of Yosemite from an image that most people probably would have tossed or deleted when they started going through their scene, specifically because it preserved that data. And the same thing can be said of other different types of scenes. You just never really know. And again, depending on the type of sensors that you're using, it really plays a big role in your ability to pull out details and fix things in terms of ideas like exposure, to do more with a single image rather than have to constantly blend images together. Like I said, this comes down to sensor size, sensor quality. A lot of people don't realize that Sony actually produces most sensors around the world, between the smartphones you guys have in your pockets to obviously the sensors that they have in most of their Alpha line, as well as Nikon and a handful of other different manufacturers out there. But knowing the limitations and the benefits of your sensor and your gear really can make a difference, especially when it comes to post-processing, because that's really where you're pulling all these elements together. Don't overly complicate your images. We talked a little bit about this when we're talking about removing distractions. The idea that we can come to a scene. This was photographed in the wild animal sanctuary just outside Denver, Colorado, where I live. And it's a beautiful tiger pen, and there's a handful of tigers around. I didn't want to tell their story. I wanted to focus in on this individual. By using my telephoto lens, I was essentially able to get in and capture the look on this tiger's face as he looked at me, probably like he wanted to eat me. And that was okay with me because I was able to capture this specific intimate moment that this animal and I shared for a very fleeting second before he turned away and was doing everything else that he was doing. If I didn't have my telephoto on, if I wasn't looking for something like this image wouldn't be nearly as compelling if it was taken with a wide-angle lens. You saw the rest of the park and the lions or the tigers just looking at me. This is an ice cave in Iceland, same type of thing. Beautiful ice cave, lots of stuff that you can do. A lot of people just pull out their wide-angle lenses and are trying to capture these big, grand scenes. I saw this one icicle sticking down, which is quite large, actually. This is probably about 20 feet in length total. And it just really captivated me. The light was hitting it nice. I was able to expose for it, pull down those shadows a little bit in post-processing, essentially isolating things a little bit more and simplifying my image. This is a photo that I took. This is unedited in the Lofoten Islands in Norway this past winter. Beautiful scene. We had really nice light this one morning. I was really happy with the colors and the exposure of everything that I was seeing. But I threw on my telephoto lens because I wanted to capture something that was a little bit more intimate. I didn't want the distractions maybe of having to do a long exposure and then trying to remove the movement of the water at the bottom of the scene or everything else, the shadow, how it was playing together. Instead, I was able to essentially focus in on what I wanted, isolate my subject, and again, tell a more compelling story. We okay? Wait, I have a little bit. I'll just speed through. Okay. Give it a sense of place. This is the idea that you want to make sure that the photograph that you're taking has a sense of where you're at. So again, we're working in an ice cave. This is a Bedouin man in Jordan that essentially, when you look at the scene, you have a feeling of where you're at. I think a lot of time when you look at photographs, you don't necessarily get that feeling where you're like, okay, where is my sense of place? And then experiment with exposure. Again, the idea that every exposure has a minimum of 6 correct exposures, and that's just where you have balanced light. So learn to play with things like spot metering or center-weighted metering, where you're adjusting the overall image in order to capture the light spectrums of light that you find the most captivating, that highlight or focus on your subject. Again, this is with a male in Haiti, and essentially, because he was dark-skinned, it was shot in the middle of the day. Being able to balance directly off his skin, instead of worrying about the light in the background, allowed me to create a high-key image that to me is much more compelling. And then again, the idea that you can kind of see what you get with electronic viewfinders is something that to me is very powerful about mirrorless cameras, allowing you to see what you get rather than an optical viewfinder that essentially shows you what your eyes see, which is often where a lot of people get confused when it comes to composing their shots and exposing. So we talked a little bit about adding depth and allowing viewers to look through your entire scene, essentially allowing people to see everything throughout your canvas. And essentially, that even works for human shots when you're shooting people, because of course you can allow a depth of field that essentially allows you to focus on your subject. Capturing movement, we talked about the benefits of essentially adding movement to add emotion to your shots, to pull people in and feel that they're more vested to what they're doing. The same thing happens when you want to freeze movement as well, especially with things like sports or water. Really adds an element of frozen in time, which is another mantra that gets used with photography quite a bit. Perspective and scale, adding a human element in there to essentially allow you to feel how big or large or small things can be. Human element works best because it usually is pretty universal, we feel, with how big or small people are. And essentially that can help you make a difference in really creating something unique. A lot of people can't see the small little dots at the top of the black and white image there on your left, but to me, those 2 individuals that are hiking up on the top of that sand dune really make the shot rather than everything else. Looking for complementary colors that work well, again, so there's not distractions. Yellows and blues, greens and reds, things like that, again, allow for a more pleasing experience when viewers are looking through your shots. The devil's in the details, and this is essentially the idea that you want to photograph with a mindset that any photo you take can be blown up to billboard size. The idea that details matter. And again, a lot of people don't do that. They take a shot, they look on their iPhone, and they're like, oh, this looks great. Well, everything looks great at 3 inches. If you start thinking about things with the mentality that things can blown up bigger, then you'll pay more attention to the details. This is a beautiful photograph of a flower that I took out in California, but flower macro work, flowers are actually incredibly dirty. And so in post-processing, I had to do quite a bit of cleanup in order to create this compelling photograph, but those details made a big difference. Eyes are windows to the soul, essentially the idea that when you're photographing people, you want to make eye contact. It allows, again, the viewer to feel more emotionally attached. And this also works with wildlife photography. Again, Japanese snow monkeys essentially allowing us to feel like we're vested in the subject of the story that we're trying to tell. And this also works with, obviously, with human beings. Eye autofocus on the new A7R II, that's a picture of my son, is incredibly impressive, essentially allowing me to constantly track the eye movement of my subjects as I'm moving in and out, even when they're moving across the scene. It jumps into continuous autofocus mode and essentially allows me to never make sure that I miss the eye being in focus, assuming the rest of my exposures are correct. And the last, one of the last ones, before I go, I know we're late, is essentially there are no rules. A lot of people say you have the rule of thirds. I hate that name. I can't believe that that was ever determined to be a rule of anything. There's no rules in photography. Sometimes you feel if you want symmetry and you're putting it right in the middle, if you feel that it works for the story you're trying to tell, do it. Who cares what anyone else says? Same thing can happen with subject placement. If you look at the individual at the bottom of the scene, I felt it was more captivating bringing everyone together. Same thing with both exposure and subject placement on the other image there, essentially creating a more compelling story that worked for me as the artist, as the storyteller. And then, of course, you can do things where you're zooming in with focus using slow shutter speeds to create unique images that most people wouldn't otherwise. So learning to develop your creative vision is my last one, and I know we're late. And this is essentially the idea of everything that we talked about today. The idea of subject selection, the idea of composition, the idea of leading people through your story, of removing distractive elements, the idea that you can come across a scene and essentially get to a place as a creative individual, as an artist, to know where you want to go with it. The idea that when I go to photograph wild Icelandic horses, I know an idea in my head of what I want to capture, the story that I want to tell. That allows me to get to a much better place, much faster when I'm out there in the scene because I've learned to develop those skills over time through repetition. Same thing happens with movement and water and landscape. Again, doing Iceland where I photograph quite a bit, I know the direction I want to go. I walk up to the scene, I'm like, okay, I want to use a long exposure. I'm probably going to use around 0.6 seconds. I know that I'm going to use my 16 to 35. I know what camera I want to use. All these different elements, the more that you practice, the better you get at storytelling. And we went over, and I appreciate you guys sticking with me, but that was my presentation. So I hope you learned something.